Hello, my name is Tom Hollingsworth, and welcome to this episode of the On-Premise IT Roundtable. That's right, we've got the right idea about IT. We are joined here with a group of some of the best and brightest minds in the IT industry to talk about some of the hottest topics that are affecting network and other professionals today. I'd like to take a quick moment to introduce the guests today, and then we'll launch into our topic. Scott, you want to go ahead?
My name is Scott McDermott. I blog at moslynetworks.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at ScottM3268.
John Herbert. I blog at movingpackets.net, and on the Twitters is at Mr. Tugs.
Keith?
And I'm Keith Norby. I work for NetApp. I'm at Keith Norby on Twitter. My blogs have been shortened to 140 characters plus, depending upon how you stick images in there. So I'll get back to full blogging soon.
My name is Michael Bagg, and I'm also at NetApp. I am a solutions architect for the next generation data center team. And you will just have to find me in the analog world. Turn your head slightly to the left and say hello.
There you go. All right, gentlemen, well, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and being able to be here. I want to talk today about something that is considered a hot emerging topic in IT, specifically in networking, and it has the potential to really affect the way that we do our jobs, and that's network functions virtualization. We've all spent years living in a world of boxing. We have routers and firewalls and load balancers and switches and network application appliance modules that analyze traffic and all kinds of things. But they're quickly disappearing from the data center because they're all becoming software. And there are quite a few people out here, probably listeners to this podcast, that are asking themselves right now, what is NFV? So I want to take a little bit of time here to explain what it is, why it's important, why it's going to impact your future. And maybe we'll have some interesting conversations. So Keith, why don't you go ahead and kick us off here? What is NFV?
Excellent question. And for a lot of folks, it's a very confusing topic because it might be confused with software-defined networking.
That's true. It does get brought up a lot with SDN.
And the best way, and Michael Bagg has really helped me in this, coming from the field expertise formerly at TELUS and having some real-life on-hands expertise with this. The best way to really think this through is from bottoms up and tops down. Bottoms up meaning, every data center capability, and network function virtualization is really just a category definition about what we're trying to produce out of a data center for something within, in this case, in telco primarily, and then expanding to the enterprise. So if you think of compute, network, and storage as like the three big resource pools that basically bring these things to life. From there, you've got all the raw hardware assets, of storage, compute, and networking still has to have ports. It still needs to have routing. It still needs to have all the things that wire things together. You can't obfuscate from that. Next up from there, all of a sudden becomes this transition point for us to talk about. And that's sometimes where SDN has come into the play, where you start taking appliances like firewall appliances, load balancing appliances, anything in the rack that was networking, that you can take from an appliance and virtualize it into either a VM or a container service, now becomes something that's software in either a service or a VM that can be managed. Then they start to become functions on the network. And so NFV's first kind of split from the category of functions is virtual network functions, or VNFs. And so these things become a firewall that used to be an appliance now becomes the VM or a container that is deployed as a virtual network function. So it's got a deployment model in a network. And so if you have networks that get spun up and spun down kind of at the speed of how we click our devices, this primarily is what's driving the need for networks to become functions rather than appliances. And so as that kind of gets to scale, you start thinking of the scale of like AT&T and some others, you've got lots and lots of these regional pods that they have to fuel basic resources from hardware, and then have the ability to fire up and tear down functions that used to have to be appliances. And as you can imagine, you just can't rack appliances or turn things on or turn things off at the appliance hardware level. There's just not enough agility in that. And so that's where base networking starts to become less about specific or specialized appliances and more about software VMs, network functions. It's not just the SDN part of making hardware appliances become software. It's beyond that because they become functions. They become functional parts of to deploy this specific thing. And in this case, the big driver for everything is 5G. It's the next evolution beyond what we're driving on our cell phones. That'll be magnitudes of order faster. And if you think about the magnitude of the population of the world adopting this as fast as the carriers will make it available, and Sprint wanting to do it for half the cost of Verizon, there's massive amounts of both bandwidth, agility, and cost cutting all converging at the same time, and that is NFV.
That sounds like a really interesting story, but I actually want to pick up on a point here, and I want John to give me his thoughts as soon as I make this statement, because John, I think, and I are on the same wavelength here. So you're talking about taking applications that are essentially running on hardware in the network, and you're going to virtualize them into a package, and you're going to ship them off of the network appliances. Now, I know you guys work for NetApp, and the storage teams and the virtualization teams, they've had their hatchet burying moment, and we're all happy people together. But the network team, we're still the holdouts. We're the kids playing over in the corner with our own little specialized hardware, and we don't like giving up our hardware. And essentially what you're telling me is you want to take my functions and give them to the compute team because they're now running on VMs. John, are you willing to give up control of your firewall and load balancer systems to the compute teams because we manage the VMs around here?
I feel like Cartman right now. Screw you guys, I'm going home.
Yeah.
So I'd love to. I think, well, it's going to be a problem. No one wants to give control. And we've had the same problem even between security and networks, right? If you have a device, even a hardware device that both routes and acts as a firewall, who owns that, security or networking? Who should own that? Should there be a division of administrative control of those devices? The nice thing about VNF is you can still have those virtualized devices individually managed, right? You just got to figure out how to service chain that stuff so that everything flows through the right device. I did want to follow up on something that Keith said, which is, so from the perspective of 5G, from the service providers, or telcos' perspective, this is something great for them because they then get agility to spin up services for their own networks. It's also an awesome thing to sell. Right, so each of those virtualized network functions is now a product. It's a checkbox on a configuration page that's an additional fee to the customer every month. Your customer wants a firewall. Ching, hey, I just built it on your virtualized CE box. Right, I'm not shipping a router to site anymore. I'm shipping an x86 box. You want IPS? Boom, got it. And that speaks particularly to the idea of increased bandwidth, where you can't have centralized devices now. You can't have them sitting in a colo where everything comes in, 50 gig, 100 gig plus. It's great to be able to distribute everything around. And that's really where this stuff comes in. And from a cost perspective, the service providers love that, because if you can make it work, that's a huge caveat. If you can make it work properly.
Yep, so this is where the challenges you talk about, where a mobile service environment, mobile service office, or a POP, those environments are not traditional places where you will find a three-tier architecture that supports a VM or supports containers. These are typically DC power, NEBS compliant, hardware box locations that all of a sudden you're now telling teams, guess what? You now have to manage this three-tier architecture to support that, however you want to do it, whether it's going to be with a converged infrastructure, whether it's going to be with the typical legacy kinds of environment that you're going to build to support that. And that's where NetApp is coming in. You have to have storage as a component of that, which is going to be critical to how you deliver those services as we begin to decouple these hardware platforms into software. And by the way, you're going to need a lot, because we're talking about 30 years of circuitry building these functions to process packets that are now being scraped off of that and put into a VM in the software world.
Yeah, and I think there was a view for a while that was not going to be feasible. I can think of somebody at one of the large networking vendors who was very insistent on the idea that, okay, if you're doing deep packet inspection, sure, an x86 is perfect for this, right? But if you're just pushing packets through, you'll never beat an ASIC. And I think the latest chips, and more importantly, the drivers and SDKs that are coming with those, are kind of putting the lie to that, because the focus has changed so much from the general CPU manufacturers. They are blasting network packets through now to the point where you really can run all these functions on a box at wire speed, which was not possible 2-3 years ago.
Not to mention you're breaking it from having a centralized location where you're aggregating your hardware is now being distributed to where the workload is actually being produced, right? So you're moving into this kind of cloud edge NFV environment where instead of having it, because you can only afford to buy a couple of these hardware devices at the cost that they were, you would put them here. Now you can break that down and put it wherever the load is being produced, especially when we begin to get into automotive telematics and those kinds of things.
So an interesting use case there that I just realized is the idea that by centralizing hardware in a specific location, we create boundaries to scale. And one of the places that's never been more apparent is in wireless, where we had to buy huge, gigantic controllers and put them in the central area because we had to have all the APs home back to that. But we're starting to see a lot of companies develop software-based wireless controllers, which are essentially NFV boxes, and being able to distribute them wherever we please. I mean, Scott, do you see using NFV for wireless as a huge driver to keep wireless scaling? Because as Keith brings up with 5G, wireless is the future, and we know this because nobody at this table has a device on the table plugged into anything other than power.
No RJ45s here, right?
And no RJ45s. It's a huge enabler for scale because, like you said, the controllers were starting to get really big, multiple 10 gig ports just to try and get all of the traffic at larger sites through it, and you start to get some really big and really expensive pieces of hardware, whereas if you can push it out to the edge, then you can start to offload, and then you can start potentially to be doing small, tiny, software controllers because you already have a bunch of servers at the site anyway, run all of your local services, so then you can have the smaller controllers at the sites, and then it's easier to scale, but then I feel like there's some management problems that come into this as we have to have tools that allow us to manage all of these virtual devices that we have now, because we had the firewall and everything went through the firewall, and now we have 64 firewalls, and that's a different management thing. It's a great scaling thing for performance, but I'm not sure I'm not sure if the tools are there yet for managing it outside of things that have been homebrewed.
What's interesting is I got a chance to sit in a presentation from the CIO of the Minnesota Vikings that just brought on the big new US Bank Stadium. And it's funny because they're going to be hosting the Super Bowl this year. And so he's talking about some of the network designs to support, the functions of, almost 100,000 people, on devices, on their Wi-Fi, and on their AT&T and Verizon and other networks. And it's pretty interesting to think through, the stats he was talking about for Super Bowl traffic. Normal Vikings game, they're seeing somewhere in the range of 6 gig a second throughput, and Super Bowls are like 11. So the continual ramp, when you think probably in a year or two, it'll be double that, because you'll start, Facebook living Super Bowl moments, or, who knows what the hell. It's pretty much whatever the networks will let you do that people will just do.
Yeah, and I think that actually brings up a really interesting point, Scott, is a lot of the discussions that I've been having with companies that are specifically focused on NFV recently have not been about how do we take an appliance and make it a VM. It's how do we manage that? How do we make it multi-tenant so that if I'm running 75 firewall instances on a box, that I know that these 20 are talking to this group that bought them, and those 23 over here are talking to that group with one consistent user interface amongst them. So maybe John, as the administrator of XYZ company, logs in and he just sees his 20 firewalls. But me, as the organizational administrator of the entire box, I can go in and manage and move and change. Do we have to change the way that we manage devices? And could that be one of the reasons why NFV is really causing paradigm shifting, is because now we don't have to go box to box to box to manage things?
If you have human intervention in there somewhere, you're hooped.
Yeah.
We're talking about moving away from manual configuration, manually configuration, to automation, to templating, to scripting, to machine. We're going to start having network function virtualization tenants that are going to expect to be able to self-configure, self-grow, self-scale.
And this is kind of where the confusion comes with SDN, right? Is that the actual NFV part of it is not really software-defined networking, whatever that really means. However, the control of it, whether it's a cloud-based controller or it's just a centralized system that's going to manage stuff, or whether it ends up being something that's driven by requests from provisioning systems as people request particular things, that really is software-driven. It's not human-driven, which is the whole point. If you want to be agile, you've got to cut us out of the loop one way or another.
That's right.
Right? And where I find that particularly interesting, and probably the most active use case right now, please forgive me now for saying SD-WAN, but I know. But taking that to the next level, and this is something Riverbed were talking about a year ago, and I know other people are now, was their idea was, okay, look, we'll put this box in the edge there. By the way, we just acquired this company who does LAN and wireless with a cloud-based controller too. I've redesigned the OS so I can now containerize within this platform. And so their idea is, okay, now I can push out via a centralized control system. I can now control your wireless. I can now control your LAN switching. I can control your WAN. By the way, I can accelerate that too. Oh, you need a firewall? We can deploy a container. And so now that NFV function, which was really telco service provider focused, starts moving in its own little way into the enterprise, and you start now changing how you manage global enterprises.
It's already
and the
beginning
WAN.
it's moving up in both directions.
Right, they're gonna meet in the middle almost.
Hyperscale and the telcos down to smaller, the smaller and medium businesses that have the agility to begin to ingest this right now because they don't have the legacy to pull along with them.
Yeah.
They can begin moving into this next gen NFV world now because they don't have to carry that behind them. I find that these folk who have to somehow mix their brownfield and greenfield environments to do this are mired in some difficulties. Because how do you begin to merge those environments with these modern management and orchestration tools that operate at the WAN and at the more localized areas? Like these integrations between the WAN Mano, between the management and orchestrations for a specific pod is very difficult to do.
It'll get
Yeah,
even. Go ahead.
Good.
I was going to say that's the interesting part. The first time you said the word Mano, which is a completely foreign term to a lot of folks, it's a manager of managers. It's at such scale that each pod has a manager of the VNFs, and globally you have to have managers of managers, and maybe even managers of managers of managers, and having everything API connected, because at the global scale of telcos, you can't manually provision.
Yep.
That has to be completely automatically done in a framed, NFV network, which is what blows your mind, because a lot of infrastructure today, and this is sort of like the new checklist, the new criteria, is you have to almost have 100% API exposed capabilities because everything has to be programmed and wired for completely autonomous operations. That's the goal.
So I think I see where the disconnect is coming from the world where we can automate and provision things versus, let's face it, this side of the table is the networking world where we don't do things like that. And I remember hearing this in virtualization 10 years ago.
Yeah.
There's no way that you can automate the deployment of a server. There's too many things that need to be done
right.
to it. And now look where we are with the world of cloud and Amazon Web Services, where I don't even worry about what OS is running on my server anymore. I select the box that says database.
Yeah.
And what do I get? Well, in certain cases, I can get a complete LAMP stack pushed down onto a box where I'm running an application. I don't even care what it's doing. And that's, I think where NFV wants to be. And that's where a lot of the initiatives that we're seeing that were announced, we're at Cisco Live this week, around this intuitive networking idea. When you look at what they were trying to build with ACI, and they still are to a bit, but where that's evolving, it's no longer, I need to provision a firewall here, I need to provision a load balancer here. It's, I want this to happen. Do the things that make that happen, and I don't want to worry about it.
If I have to cut a ticket to request a firewall rule to be provisioned 3 months from now, I'm in deep trouble.
And of course, the networking team is going to push back on you and say, okay, that's great that this application needs a firewall open. Can you tell me which ports it is? Because I don't know anything about your app. Whereas if we can connect all those things through APIs, and the app can say, I need these 7 ports open, and it communicates via API to the controller, if you will, and the controller says, okay, I've tunneled these ports open for your IP. Please let me know when you don't need them open anymore, and I'll tear the entire thing down.
Yep. And I've already established policy rules and a framework that has to fit through before those things happen.
And it's all auditable.
Thank you.
And it's all auditable, so in the event that WannaCry 3 comes out, and suddenly we're trying to figure out, well, is our organization vulnerable to this because we left a back door open for a server that nobody uses anymore, we can pull the logs of the communication with all the applications. We go, nope, we shut down all the SMB1 ports years ago, and we're good.
Well, and more importantly, if you need to make an emergency change across your company to filter something out, it's much easier to do
That's true.
because you're now not configuring 100 boxes, right? Which is a situation I think many people will recognize. I kind of like to look at NFV in some ways as like VMware NSX on steroids. It's like the next step after that, because I think that got some people into the mindset of understanding that it's possible to distribute a firewall. It's okay. because they didn't have to configure lots and lots of firewalls. You configured policies and let NSX figure out where those need to be implemented within every hypervisor, right? And I like this same idea of being able to push that policy out.
Yes.
It is intent again. I want this to be able to talk to that. I don't want to worry about which firewalls that's relevant to. I mean, I'd prefer not to put it on the firewalls where those subnets don't even exist, right? Mm-hmm. But it'd be great to be able to shift them out. And then if a device moves, for that policy to move with it automatically. And this is all stuff we can start doing. And that's where, as I say, that's that blur of SDN and NFV again. You've got to be able to control the heck out of this stuff. Yep. And you've got to have huge trust in whatever system you do, which means chances are you're buying somebody's system. You're not coding this stuff yourself, right?
No, I think this was a good discussion, guys. There's a lot to NFV. There's a lot more than just taking a thing and making it software. Oh, yeah. There's a lot of organizational shifts that are going to happen. Honestly, there's going to be a lot of soul searching from the box herders. But we've already lived through that in the virtualization world, and I think now it's time for networking to get their stuff sorted out. And I'm going to be very interested to see where this goes in the next 7 or 8 months.
And I would say one part of the interesting layer of the technology stack is look at OpenStack's Project Tacker. If you look at a lot of the deployments, basically all the deployments I know of are all done on OpenStack, using Tacker as its way to deploy the VNFs as VMs. And I still haven't seen, and there's a growth in the containers, but still haven't seen a kind of an emergence outside of the base, OpenStack premise that everyone's using. And if you see Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei, Red Hat, Cisco, they're all looking at that model. They're all coming up with the reference architectures now to talk about how they launch the VNFs out of their VIMs and deploy these things at scale. Yeah. And I always still love to come back to the campfire stories that Michael had from TELUS and actually hear the real life projects that drove these things. And
right. I think we're going to find some applicability from what gets produced to support NFV is going to be leveraged for a number of other media delivery. For instance, as you look at the architecture that supports that, it looks very similar to the Etsy architecture that's used for NFV. This same kind of framework, the same kind of architecture. We're going to find that creeping its way into many different delivery platforms.
All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us today. I think that this is a topic that's going to get a lot more discussion going forward. Hopefully we'll be able to come back to this in 6 or 7 months and kind of see where we are. And hopefully, we've moved down the road quite a bit. For those of you who are listening to the podcast or watching it right now, you can always find the latest episode at gestaltit.com/podcast. You can also find us in iTunes and any one of your favorite podcast apps. Do us a favor, like, share, subscribe, leave a comment. How can we make this better? How can we address your concerns and talk about the things that you want to hear? We want to be the premise behind all of the things that you are talking about. So for me and Tom Hollingsworth, for my guests, and a special thank you to my friends at NetApp, we're going to go ahead and call it a day here, but be sure to stay tuned for even more great things coming from the On-Premise IT Roundtable.